Hello and welcome back to our next Interregnum video. I'm Father Jason Tyler, pastor at St. Joseph Catholic Church in Fayetteville, sharing some thoughts and reflections and reports, I guess, and you might say in some way, on what's happening in Rome with the transition between Pope Francis, may he rest in peace, and his successor, whom obviously we don't know yet. As I'm recording this, it is Friday morning, April the 25th, but this will upload probably Saturday morning. And what I want to do today is just recount some of the things we've seen so far. Now, obviously, by the time this publishes, so to speak, we will have seen the funeral already. And so I don't have any thoughts on that yet because it hasn't happened yet for me. But I may have some in the next video. I did speak in my previous one about what you can expect to see in the funeral, what is likely to be seen, and how it's in some ways similar to other Catholic funerals that you've been to, and in some ways different as well. And so if you haven't seen that, you can certainly go back and watch episode 2 of this series on the papal funeral. But today what I want to talk about again is what we've seen so far, what has happened already up to this point, because I didn't start doing these videos until a few days after the Pope's death, and so didn't get a chance to talk about some of the things that happened immediately after his death, and so I want to go through some of that today. One of the first things that happens when the Pope dies is there are a couple of different official announcements of his death. Now, Pope Francis died at 7:35 in the morning, Rome time, which would be 12:35 in the morning for us in Arkansas. I was asleep at that time. I imagine most folks were. And so I didn't hear about it until I woke up around 6 o'clock that morning. But again, in Rome, it was 7:35 in the morning. I believe the announcement went out around 9:30, 9:45, so just a couple of hours later. Now, that would be different, too, than what happened with John Paul II, but that's because the circumstances of their deaths were very different. John Paul II, we all knew he was dying. You know, there had been an announcement, a few days before he ultimately passed, that he was sick again. He had been in the hospital earlier that year. In fact, it's very similar. John Paul II was hospitalized for a few days in February, came back to the Vatican, limited his public appearances, and ultimately died in April. Pope Francis was hospitalized in February. Now, he had a much longer hospitalization. He was in the hospital like 5 weeks or something, I think. But ultimately went back to the Vatican, severely limited his public appearances, but did not eliminate them, as we've seen, right? He visited with J.D. Vance and with King Charles and some others, and then made an appearance in St. Peter's Square even on Easter Sunday. But Pope Francis, of course, died in April. So there are some parallels in that sense. But yes, I think the public announcement was a little bit later in the case of Pope Francis because, again, maybe of the surprise nature of his death. There weren't sort of several people around on death watch, as it were, for lack of a better term. But the Pope's announcement, you got sort of the press announcement on the one hand, but then you also have some other very official sorts of announcements. One of those is made early on by an official called the Camerlengo. Now, Camerlengo is an Italian word. The English translation is Chamberlain, but often we end up hearing the Italian word thrown around, partly because I think it's kind of a funner word to say, maybe, and in part because Chamberlain is not even a really common word in English, and if we had it, we probably aren't thinking about the guy that's doing what the Camerlengo does during a papal interregnum. But the Camerlengo is responsible, yes, for announcing that the Pope has died, and he does so early on. There's an official called they call him often the Cardinal Vicar of Rome. Basically, he's the Vicar General or number 2 official for the Diocese of Rome. He is responsible for announcing it to the Roman people and sort of seeing to their pastoral care in that time. One of the announcements that's made officially also is to the diplomatic corps of ambassadors that are accredited to the Holy See. So the Vatican or the Holy See is a sovereign nation. It is enjoys the rights and privileges of a sovereign nation in that way. And so they have ambassadors. There's a Vatican ambassador in the United States. The term for him is a nuncio, Nuncio. A nuncio is the Pope's ambassador to a given country. But then the United States has an ambassador to the Holy See. Actually, at the moment we might not, because when there's a new president that comes in, as President Trump has only been in office for a few months, sometimes that the new ambassadors don't get appointed immediately. Sometimes there's a lag of a few months, and I think that may be the case now. I think Trump has announced someone, but I'm not sure that he's gone through Senate confirmation and everything yet. So at any rate, though, the United States normally has an ambassador to the Holy See. The United Kingdom has an ambassador. Canada has an ambassador. Mexico has, most countries do. Some don't for various political or even religious reasons, but most do. And so they get an official notification of the Pope's death as well. There was, this time as well, I saw some of the clips of the Camerlengo. And the Camerlengo, by the way, someone with strong American ties, Cardinal Kevin Farrell. Cardinal Farrell was born in Ireland and grew up there. But as a priest, he was working in the United States for a while, and ultimately he became auxiliary bishop of Washington. Now, an auxiliary bishop is someone who has the full sacramental authority of a bishop, so he can do confirmation, he can ordain, he's a successor to the apostles, but he doesn't have the governance of a diocese. Instead, he assists another bishop. So the parallel is, if you think about your parish, I'm the pastor at St. Joseph. I have an associate pastor. He's just as much a priest as I am. He can celebrate the Eucharist, he can hear confessions, he can anoint the sick, all those functions, but he's not in charge of the parish. Instead, he assists me in the governance of the parish. In a similar way, an auxiliary bishop has the full sacramental authority of the bishop, but not the administrative or governance authority. And instead, again, he's assisting the ordinary or the diocesan bishop. So Cardinal Farrell was an auxiliary bishop in Washington for a little while, then was Bishop of Dallas for a few years before getting called to Rome, and he worked in one of the Roman dicasteries, one of the Roman departments. And the Camerlengo role was kind of an additional thing to his main role, because most of the work of the Camerlengo doesn't kick in until a pope either dies or resigns. And so Cardinal Farrell, as part of the official ascertaining of the Pope's death, calls the Pope's baptismal name 3 times. Now, there's some significance here theologically. There's a practical thing, right, in the sense that what name is the Pope most likely to respond to if he's only kind of partially conscious or whatever there. He might respond to Francesco, which is the Italian word for Francis. But it's very likely he's going to respond quicker to Jorge Mario, his baptismal name. So there's a practical side. But there's also really a theological element here as well, because when we die, we go before the Lord, and it's really our baptism that has the biggest effect on our soul, as it were, as we enter the next life. And so there's a way of saying his baptismal name rather than his papal name, sort of recognizing that, yes, if he has gone from us, if he's gone from this world, then we really value and think about him as a baptized person as much as thinking about him as Pope. In centuries past, there used to be this thing, they had this little silver hammer they'd tap on the Pope's head 3 times as part of it. I don't think that's part of the official ascertaining of the Pope's death anymore. I haven't found that for certain, but I don't see it explicitly written in the text of what's supposed to happen anymore. So I don't think that's a thing anymore. But in centuries past, yes, there was a silver hammer that was used. You can imagine from times past when the medical technology wasn't as great, you couldn't rely as fully on, say, a medical declaration of death as we do now. And so that silver hammer might have had more of an importance in saying, okay, we really need to be certain that he's no longer with us. So they ascertained his death. There was a reading, I think the next day, of the Pope's last will and testament, which was very, very short. Pope Francis had few or no possessions, so there was no need to sort of divide those out. But he did specify the place of his burial in St. Mary Major Basilica. I think I talked about that yesterday. And he specified that a benefactor would pay for that burial. And that was an interesting twist. I mean, I simply would have assumed there's a Vatican budget line somewhere that says, okay, we're spending X amount of euros to cut into the tile of this basilica and put his body there and then seal it up again. And I'm sure that could have been the case, but perhaps someone very close to the Pope had stepped forward and volunteered for this a while back. Perhaps the Pope sought someone out, but we don't know who that is. But it was an interesting sort of twist that he said there's a benefactor that will pay for the expense of having him buried in that church. The papal apartment was sealed. Now, in this case, there were sort of two places that were sealed, and that is the official papal apartment in the Apostolic Palace, which was where Pope Francis worked from, and that's where most popes had lived. But Pope Francis early on said he wanted to live closer to other people, so he actually lived over in the Vatican guest house, Casa Santa Marta if you're using the Italian name, Domus Sanctae Martae if you're using the Latin name. So both of those get sealed, and in this case, when we talk about seal, there's this ribbon they tie around the door, and then there's like a wax seal that's put on it. This goes back to some ages past when corruption was probably far more of a concern between popes, and a question of not wanting anyone to get into the papal apartments and try to put something in there that made it seem that the Pope wanted something that he didn't really want, or that someone might have even tried to steal something or whatever. But the papal apartment is sealed, and the Pope's the residence, the area he stayed in at the guest house, is sealed until the next Pope is elected, in which case he will be able to go in to sort of inspect what is there. Also, the fisherman's ring was destroyed. The fisherman's ring is simply the name of the ring that the Pope wears. St. Peter himself was a fisherman. The Pope is the successor to St. Peter, and so they call his ring the fisherman's ring. That was destroyed because the ring, historically, was used to seal documents. So you'd have the Pope would write something out, and then he'd take his ring and he'd press down on the paper so that you would know it was authentic. Because again, before video communication and everything, even if you were in France and you got this thing that said it was from Rome, you got to look at it and say, okay, is this really from Rome? Is this really from the Pope? Or is it somebody pretending to be him? And that seal from the ring was part of how you knew that. But that gets destroyed now, again, to prevent any sort of fraud, to prevent anyone writing something, using that ring to seal it, and sort of writing it as though it were published a couple of months ago, and or it was written a couple of months ago maybe, and we are just now seeing it for whatever reason. So no, the ring gets destroyed early on after the death of the Pope for that reason. We saw his body transferred to St. Peter's Basilica, and if I'm remembering right, that was Wednesday morning, so it was transferred from, again, that guest house where the Pope lived and where he died, there to the Basilica, where the body is now, as I'm recording this, is now lying in state, and it will be lying in state until Friday evening. So by the time you see this, it's no longer lying in state, but pilgrims can come and visit. They're closing the Basilica, St. Peter's Basilica, for only like an hour and a half or 2 hours every day for cleaning. And that's like probably 3 or 4 in the morning. They're shutting it down. Otherwise, that line of people keeps flowing through. This was a very interesting thing when John Paul II died and when I was there in Rome. I had not expected the response to be as strong as it was. And of course, it was a wonderful thing. But I remember going to see the Pope's body, and I got in line like at 3 in the afternoon. Now the line, when I say I got in line, the line was probably a good half a mile or more from the door of the Basilica, and it was 11 o'clock at night before I got in, maybe a little bit later than that. So I was in line like 8 hours, and I got to see his body for all of like 15 seconds because they're rushing people along. You can't stop and linger. They've got guards there, and like if you stop, they're going to say, "Hey, buddy, keep moving, keep going." So I took a couple of pictures, but they're kind of blurry because I was actually walking literally while taking the picture, and so they didn't turn out so great there necessarily. But it was a beautiful thing to see again when all those people that came to see John Paul II lying in state. I understand, similar things going on right now with Pope Francis. They're talking just an hour and a half a day that it's closed. Otherwise, people keep coming through. And with John Paul II, by the time they shut down the line, they had to close everything off to get ready for the funeral the night before. There were people who had waited like 24 hours in this line. And they were very good. Italy, has a reputation sometimes of being kind of lackadaisical about things and kind of not efficient. They were really efficient in that interregnum between John Paul II and Benedict XVI. They had porta potties out everywhere in this line. They had kind of planned out this line, snaked around different buildings. So it went down the big wide street that leads up to St. Peter's, the Via della Conciliazione, and then wrapped around some of the streets or some of the buildings onto other streets. And they had Boy Scouts handing out bottles of water. Just a great thing overall. But anyway, those are some of the things that have happened already. Probably some foreign dignitaries are being sort of brought up and allowed to see the Pope lying in state without having to go through the whole line. I know that was the case in 2005. President George W. Bush came in along with former President Clinton, and I want to say maybe former President George H.W. Bush came as well, as all kind of part of the American delegation. And they didn't have to wait in the long line, and security would not have allowed that for one thing, but they sort of got brought in through a side door, and so I think other foreign dignitaries may do the same, so we may see footage of that before it's all done. All right, I've gone over my 15 minutes again. Sorry about that. I get real excited and get into these things, but again, that's just a recap of what's happened so far. My next video, I'm going to talk about what's called the Novendial or Novemdial Masses. There are a couple different ways of spelling that and pronouncing that, and I'll talk about why that is, how long those go, kind of what they are, when they started, and how they can sort of tie into other practices in the Catholic faith. So, and I may have some thoughts on the funeral too. I am planning to be up early and watch it, so we'll see if I'm kind of, really tired looking at my next video from having got up so early. But anyway, thanks for watching. Please subscribe, and I'll see you for the next one. Bye.